Well, hello, folks, and welcome to our very last lecture that pertains to exam number 2. This is hopefully not going to be a very long lecture. It's going through some of the major issues we've already brought up. We brought up the very beginning of the rise of Islam, for instance. We have brought up the church and the church's role in the early Middle Ages as the Roman Empire was fading away. The Roman Church was really kind of what took over, at least in the West. And then we're going to look at a major event that happens between two large and powerful states in Europe during the High Middle Ages. And it's an event called the 100 Years' War that actually lasts about 100 years, and they never really came up with a better name for it, at least for the entire event. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about why that's important to a transition that's going to be happening at the time in Europe. So let's get on to it. First of all, I haven't gotten into much depth when it comes to the rise of Islam. Well, it's time for us to look a little bit more into the background of Islam, because although our focus is on the rise of culture in the West and Western civilization, Islam has influenced much of Western Europe as well. So why not get into it a little bit? What is Islam exactly, and how does that history matter? I'm going to play a short video from John Green's crash course in world history. I know that John Green speaks quickly, and he tends to be focused more towards high school students, really. But he does a great job with his research and his presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and play that here, which gets us into some of the questions that shows up on the exam, not only just about Islam in general, but the 5 pillars and a little bit more. So here we go with that now.
Hi there, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about Islam, which, like Christianity and Judaism, grew up on the east coast of the Mediterranean. But unlike Christianity and Judaism, it's not terribly well understood in the West. For instance, you probably know what this is and what this is. You probably don't know what that is. Google it. Mr. Green, why do you think people know so little about Islamic history? Did you just ask an interesting, non-annoying question, me from the past? I think we don't know much about early Islamic history because we don't learn about it, because we're taught that our history is the story of Christianity in Europe, when in fact, our history is the story of people on the planet. So let's try to learn something today. So in less than 200 years, Islam went from not existing to being the religious and political organizing principle of one of the largest empires in the world. And that story begins in the 7th century CE when the angel Gabriel appeared to Muhammad, a 40-ish guy who made his living as a caravan trader, and told him to begin reciting the word of God. Initially, this freaked Muhammad out, as, you know, it would, but then his wife and a couple other people encouraged him, and slowly he came to accept the mantle of prophet. A few things to know about the world Islam entered. First, Muhammad's society was intensely tribal. He was a member of the Quraysh tribe living in Mecca, and tribal ties were extremely important. Also, at the time, the Arabian Peninsula was like this crazy religious melting pot. Like most tribal Arabs worshipped gods very similar to the Mesopotamian gods you'll remember from episode 3. And by the time of Muhammad, cult statues of many of those gods had been collected in his hometown of Mecca in this temple-like structure called the Kaaba. But Arabia was also home to monotheisms like Christianity and Judaism and even a bit of Zoroastrianism. So the message that there was only one God wouldn't have been like as surprising to Muhammad as it was, for instance, to Abraham. Also, and this will become very important, the northern part of Arabia was sandwiched between the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Sasanian Empire. And you'll remember, those guys were always fighting. They were like snowboarders and skiers, or like the Westboro Baptist Church and everyone else. At its core, Islam is what we call a radical reforming religion. Just as Jesus and Moses sought to restore Abrahamic monotheism after what they perceived as straying, so too did Muhammad. Muslims believe that God sent Muhammad as the final prophet to bring people back to the one true religion, which involves the worship of and submission to a single and all-powerful God. The Quran also acknowledges Abraham and Moses and Jesus, among others, as prophets, but it's very different from the Hebrew and Christian Bibles. For one thing, it's much less narrative, but also it's the written record of the revelations Muhammad received, which means it's not written from the point of view of people. It is seen as the actual word of God. The Quran is a really broad-ranging text, but it returns again and again to a couple themes. One is strict monotheism, and the other is the importance of taking taking care of those less fortunate than you. The Quran says of the good person, spends his substance however much he himself may cherish it, upon his near of kin and the orphans and the needy and the wayfarer and the beggars, and for the freeing of human beings from bondage. These revelations also radically increase the rights of women and orphans, which is one of the reasons that Muhammad's tribal leaders weren't that psyched about them. To talk more about Islamic faith and practice, let's go to the thought bubble. The 5 pillars of Islam are the basic acts considered obligatory, at least by Sunni Muslims. First is the Shahada, or the profession of faith. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is God's prophet. Second, Salah, or ritual prayer 5 times a day, at dawn, noon, afternoon, sunset, and late evening, which are obligatory unless you haven't hit puberty, are too sick, or are menstruating. Keep it PG, thought bubble. Third, Psalm, the month-long fast during the month of Ramadan, in which Muslims do not eat or drink or smoke cigarettes during daylight hours. Since Ramadan is a lunar calendar month, it moves around the seasons, and obviously it's most fun during the winter, when the days are shorter, and least fun during the summer, when days are both long and hot. Fourth is Zakat, or almsgiving, in which non-poor Muslims are required to give a percentage of their income to the poor. And lastly, Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that Muslims must try to fulfill at least once in their lives, provided they are healthy and have enough money. And there's also more to understanding Islam than just knowing the Quran. Like Judaism with its Talmud and Christianity with its lives of saints and writings of church fathers, Islam has supplementary sacred texts, chief among which is the Hadith, a collection of sayings and stories about the Prophet. One more thing about Islam. Like Christianity and Judaism, it has a body of law. You might have heard of it. It's called Sharia. Although we tend to think of Sharia as a single set of laws that all Muslims follow, that's ridiculous. There are numerous competing ideas about Sharia, just as there are within any legal tradition. So people who embraced this worldview were called Muslims because they submitted to the will of God, and they became part of the Ummah, or community of believers.
Okay, now I'm going to take a little time and let a 3-minute video talk to you a bit about this thing called the Sunni and Shia debate that occurs in Islam. And this particular person broke it down without getting overly religious or taking sides. This is kind of an outsider that comes into it in a journalistic fashion and talks about the origins of the Sunni and Shia debate. So let's go ahead and watch this real quick.
The terms Sunnis and Shiites get thrown around a lot when discussing Middle Eastern conflicts. And sometimes it's useful, but most of the time it feels like it's just shorthand for these people hate each other. But with over 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, there's no way they can all be involved in some Hatfields and McCoy-style blood feud. So what's really going on here? Well, first of all, not all Sunnis and Shiites are at war with each other. There are tons of places where they coexist peacefully, like the United Arab Emirates, or Dearborn, Michigan, for example. It's also worth noting that their religions aren't diametrically opposed. In fact, the Sunni-Shiite conflict isn't even really about religion, it's about power. Originally, Muslims were all one group, unified under the Prophet Muhammad. Then, in the year 632, Muhammad died, and Muslims split off into 2 separate groups. The Sunnis wanted Muhammad's successor to be chosen by his community of followers, while the Shiites wanted the leadership to stay within the Prophet's family. The Sunnis were in the majority, so they chose their new leader to be the Caliph, which is basically the head of state. The Shiites did not recognize this new leader, and instead, they chose Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali, as their new imam, which also basically means head of state. That was the main source of divide, and from there, things really only got worse. Early on, most of the Shiite imams met violent ends at the hands of the stronger Sunni caliphs, including Imam Ali's son, Hussein, whose beheading is still considered a major holiday for Shiite Muslims. Today, there are numerous Sunni and Shiite militant groups, terrorist organizations, and oppressive governments. Being Sunni or Shiite doesn't necessarily make you a member or even a supporter of those groups, but they're still divided up that way. In fact, every nation with Sunni-Shiite conflicts has large militant groups on both sides, and they all have a history of oppressing one another depending on who's currently in power. Iraq, for example, was run by an oppressive Shiite regime before Saddam, then an oppressive Sunni regime under Saddam, followed by an oppressive Shiite regime once again after Saddam left power. Now the oppressive Sunni militant group ISIS is threatening to take over huge parts of the country. So you can see that the Sunni-Shiite conflicts are more about power, politics, and retribution than actual religion. And truthfully, the words Sunni and Shiite aren't even the best words to use when discussing Sunni-Shiite conflicts. They are way too general. If you're talking about militant jihadists or terrorist networks, but what you really mean is ISIS or Al-Qaeda, just say ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Otherwise, you're including billions of people who aren't even involved and most likely don't share the beliefs of those fringe organizations.
Oh, all right. So the Great Schism, or Schism, however you want to say it. I like to say Schism. But the Great Schism of 1054 is a major event in Western Europe. This is only a few years before the invasion of England by the Normans. So the Normans are greatly active at this point in time. And in fact, Norman armies have already invaded southern Italy at the same time that we're talking about the Great Schism. And Norman armies under Duke William will, of course, go forth and invade England soon after. So these guys are really expanding as a state that's taking major territories in Europe at the time, those Normans. Well, let's get into what the schism of Christianity is. So Christianity began as one church around 33 Common Era. We know that already as far as an established church under Constantine. Then we have these three main branches of Christianity today. Okay, so where did these three branches come from? Because back in 33 and all the way up into 1050, there was only one church. There was just the Roman Catholic Latin-based Christian church. Well, today, there's the Roman Catholic Church, right? There's the Eastern Orthodox Church that we're going to get to today. And then, of course, in the modern era, we have the Protestant churches, and there's a ton of those, right? A ton of Protestant churches, and those come out during the Protestant Reformation, and we're not getting to that until after exam 2. That'll be a couple weeks really after this exam. So we have really a focus on how did Christianity end up splitting between the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church in the East. How did that happen? So, first of all, the Normans, as I was mentioning, around 1020, the Normans went back to their Viking roots and started invading stuff, especially important trading zones, and they were able to send ships and troops into southern Italy. The southern half of Italy was not operated by the Romans or any of the Germanic states that had conquered Rome in the boot of Italy. The southern half of Italy was actually being controlled by the Byzantines, the Eastern Romans. So although the Pope in Italy tried to defeat the Normans, in case the Normans were going to try to push past southern Italy and go into Rome itself, which they never did, the Normans did cause some trouble here. So the Normans capture the Pope and hold him hostage. They start to shut down churches in the southern half of Italy, which were controlled by the Byzantine Christians. And if you remember, the Byzantines are part of the Roman Empire that never collapsed in the ancient period. Well, what happens is when the Normans bring their Western Christian ideals, their Latin Christian ideals into southern Italy, there's going to be a fight, dogmatically anyway, arguments, I mean to say, between the Roman Catholic Normans and the Byzantines who owned southern Italy, because the Normans were closing down Byzantine Christian churches and essentially opening up something different. What's going on here? Here's an idea of where all this stuff is. Here's lands under Norman control by the time we get to 1066, and lands under Norman control at the same period. All right, so the Normans are going to take over about half of Italy during the same few decades that they were going to be expanding over on this side as well. Interesting stuff, these Normans. They come out of the north, and they take this territory here, and they expand, and then they take this territory here, and they expand, and then they cross over here, and they take all of this, right? And then you might notice here that there's some Norman activity over on this end as well during the Crusades. So the Normans are one of the very interesting cultures to study if you get into early medieval history. Okay, so what's going on? Oh, I should mention here, since I got this map up, where are the Byzantines? The Byzantines are right here, where my little pointer is, and you can see the map right there, the map key. The Byzantines are over here controlling this territory. The Empire of Islam is all the way over here, right, this entire region. And then the Western Roman Germanic states are over here. over really here. I shouldn't go down here because that's Muslim. So right here, these are the Christian states of the West. And then you've got the Byzantine Christians, which are a little bit different. And you've got this area being fought over where the Latin Christian Normans take this territory. And really, in a way, they're expanding the Christian Church of the West further than it was, since this was territory once owned by the Byzantines. Well, here's the deal. During the beginning of the 11th century, there were already tensions between the Romans of the East and the West because the empire was so big. The Roman Empire, before the fall of Rome, was so big that you remember at some point it split, right? Diocletian splits it into two pieces, and it's going to stay split pretty much the rest of its history until the Western Roman Empire collapses and the Eastern Roman Empire transitions into becoming the Byzantine Empire, its own Roman Empire. So what is the deal? Well, always there's going to be cultural issues. The Roman Empire is so big that the Western Romans were very different from the Eastern Romans, and that's not going to change as we move into the Middle Ages. You know, people that were Roman Catholic Christians out of Italy or ruled out of Italy by that Pope are not going to be the same kind of people that are still Byzantines over in the East. It's just a different culture. So let's talk a little bit about what this looks like, okay? This is almost exactly what the split looked like when we talked about the Roman emperors under Diocletian and after splitting up the Roman Empire. Interestingly, this is all very much just like that split. You know, the religious split follows that history. There's a repeat of history on the religious side. So here's what the Western Roman Catholic Church just claims as a sphere of influence. The Latin-speaking church. Okay, and then over here, the purple is what the Eastern Greek-speaking out of Constantinople, and here's Greece, right? The Constantinople side, the Eastern Orthodox Catholic Church. The deal is that before the schism, these were all run by the same church. The problem is that this Pope over here in Rome and the kind of the sub-Pope, you know, the leader of the Christians over on this side in a very powerful city known as Constantinople, well, they have some issues over how to interpret the faith, how Christianity should be executed and handled. So over here, we've got one of the Leos. There's lots of Leos, but over here we've got Pope Leo. And Pope Leo in the 1020s and 1030s and 1040s and 1050s, Pope Leo is theoretically the Pope of all of Christendom. All right, the Pope of all of it. He's the religious leader of the whole thing. But there's a bit of a fight brewing that had already been brewing. It just gets set off when the Normans invade southern Italy. And the fight starts on both sides. And here's one of the sides. I just put this little text bubble here for you. Those Byzantines so haughty, and they charge so much for trade. Here's the deal. These are the Byzantines, right? And the Byzantines are part of the Roman Empire that never fell. It was never conquered by invading Germanic peoples, okay? So they tend to have a huge chip on their shoulders, okay? These Byzantines basically look down their long noses at everybody and consider themselves to be the true Romans and true civilized people of the Mediterranean. They consider themselves better than everybody else, is what I'm trying to say. So you might have Pope Leo over here in charge of his Catholic Church, and he might be the Pope of the entire church. But in general, Pope Leo isn't a Byzantine. And these Byzantines see themselves as being the best of the best of the best, right? So they're kind of looking down. The other thing is if you live over here in Western Europe and you want to trade with the East, for a lot of your stuff, you have to go through the city of Constantinople. You have to send ships from over here, whatever country you're in, and send them all the way to Constantinople and buy things from the markets of Constantinople from the East, which means that everybody in the West kind of were annoyed by the Byzantines for those two reasons. The Byzantines were haughty and always said they're the best of the best, and on top of that, the Byzantines charged a ton of money for trade coming from the East and going into the West. So those were 2 points of contention. When the Crusades start in 1090, when the First Crusade is announced sometime later, one of the major reasons why a lot of Europeans will go on crusade, will actually sell all their stuff to buy passage to go over here to fight the Crusades, One of the reasons that they do it is because they can start new trade routes without having to use Constantinople. Okay, so it becomes this holy war where Constantinople and the Byzantines will actually look away because they kind of ask for help on this one because the Muslims are expanding so much more during the 1090s that the Byzantines are asking for help from the rest of Christianity, and the rest of Christianity invades Jerusalem and start up new trade routes, and that becomes the beginning of the end for the monopolies of trade that the Constantinople's have. Well, let's look at what the Constantinople guys. All right, so here is he's not technically the Pope, all right, but there's this guy over here in Constantinople who's supposed to be kind of like the mouthpiece of the Pope, but over in the East. And he's become so powerful that this guy is basically taking over himself. So those Western Romans, they are really just a bunch of barbarians pretending to be Romans. The deal is that the Byzantines always saw these guys over here after the fall of Rome as being just a bunch of hybrid mongrels. They're Latin Romans who have been invaded and have now intermarried, interbred with uncivilized barbarians. And at this point, basically, the Byzantines see the people in the West as just being a bunch of illiterate idiots. All right, that's kind of the viewpoint. So obviously, these two sides have their views and they don't like each other. So it's natural that there's going to be some problems religiously, since the real powers, overarching powers in the feudal system, are that the church is in charge of everything, right? The church kind of runs that whole show. So we've got the Western Romans who are not really big fans of the Eastern Romans, and vice versa. Okay, so what are some of the big tensions, okay? Eastern priests, if you were in the Byzantine Empire and a Christian, you were allowed to marry before you became a priest. Okay, so you can be a priest and be married, become a priest and still be married. That was something that happened. In the Roman Catholic Church out of Italy, that was not something you can do. If you're a priest, you take a vow of celibacy and you don't marry ever. All right, if you're on that road, you do not marry. And if you're already married, you don't get to be a Roman Catholic priest. The Roman Church over in Italy used unleavened bread in their mass. That's a type of bread without yeast. And the East thought that this was too Jewish. You guys are being too Jewish with that unleavened bread. We don't do it that way in Constantinople. And the Eastern Church had a Greek mass, meaning they spoke in Greek, whereas the Roman Church spoke in Latin, the language of the Roman Empire, the now gone Roman Empire. There's some other things. The way they looked, these people of the East and the West were different, as you might imagine. The way that they dressed were different. Okay, and the Eastern Church, the Christian church out of Constantinople, out of the Byzantine Empire, tended to worship iconography because that was something the Romans did, and since the Roman culture was not yet gone from the Byzantine side, because there have been no barbarian invasions there, or Germanic invasions, basically the Eastern Church was far more Roman than, say, the Western Church was. So anyway, the Eastern Church worshipped icons, pictures, images, statues of Mary and the baby Christ, or icons of the saints, and they would pray and worship to those as well as to God. Whereas the Western Church said you can't do that. You only pray to Christ and God. That's it. You can have all your statues in the West of saints and all that, but those are not to be prayed to. Those are just to remind us of people that were remarkable in the faith. And that's it. What's the solution to all these issues? The solution is going to be that in 1054, Pope Leo the Ninth of Rome and the Patriarch or / Bishop of Constantinople, these two different arguing leaders, are going to excommunicate each other. So you guys, this is amazing stuff. This guy and this guy are going to excommunicate each other. They're going to issue their own papal bulls on their sides in their big cities, where they tell the whole world that the other guy is wrong and therefore is unloved by God and is kicked out of the church. Okay? So that actually happens. Excommunication is the worst punishment a member of the Christian church can receive. Okay? And what that means is that in theory, you're not allowed to receive sacraments. You cannot pray to God for salvation. You're never going to heaven, according to the Christian church, if you are excommunicated. Now, excommunication is usually the threat that popes levied against kings that didn't do what they wanted them to do. This is the first time you actually see a leader in Rome and a leader in Constantinople actually both act like popes, and they both excommunicate each other from the religion. What a crazy, crazy thing to do. But that's what's going on. Now, guys, imagine what election week was like between Trump and Biden. I want you to imagine that kind of news cycle and angst and the propaganda war going on for about 30 years. I want you to imagine that fatigue amongst the people of Europe, because this fight is going to be going on for a long time between Rome and Constantinople. Okay, this fight over which church is right, the Eastern one or the Western one. So ultimately what's going to happen is there's just going to be a division, a schism, a split. And the division is going to be a church called the Roman Catholic Church, which serves Western Europe, and the Eastern Orthodox Church, which serves Eastern Europe. And that's it. There's just going to be a split. And so now, by 1054, there are two different churches in the world as far as Christian ones, the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox. So this gives you an idea of the spread of the two different churches. This is the Western Roman Church. All right, and this church, the Roman Catholic Church is the other way to put it, spreads its version of Christianity through this entire region here. And then right here is Constantinople and the Greek Orthodox Church. And the Greek Orthodox Church spreads this way, all the way over to Croatia, and then up into what is now Russia. So when you talk to Russian Christians, very often they're more familiar with the Greek Orthodox or the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is kind of taken on its own air now, a Russian Orthodox Church, but that's what it's based off of, this kind of Constantinople-style church. And then over here, you've got all these guys with their Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic. So that's the split that happens here. All right. So, final topic of the day, the Black Death hits, as we talked about a little bit before, and there's going to be a couple of wars that happen during the reoccurring waves of Black Death. Let me read this slide. In 1352, the Black Death hit Western Europe in waves, plowing through and then returning later to do so again, over and over for several decades. Over 30 million will die in the first 10 years and many millions more over the next several decades. The survivors, like in a Mad Max movie, will fight constantly over resources and territory. When the Black Death hits, there are going to be some areas, especially big cities, that go into complete and utter lockdown panic mode. You've got the people in the great city of Paris digging hundreds of miles of catacombs underneath Paris to bury their dead. You've got people throughout the rest of the world who are freaking out and wondering how they're going to survive the Black Death. There are many who think that the end of the world is coming, that Christ is coming back again, which in the Christian church heralds the Revelations books, the end of the world and the reckoning, the whole thing. You've got a lot of people that just felt like the end of the world was happening, and they felt like this a lot over and over and over. And then people would start to recover once the plague kind of ran through its course, and then the plague would come back again and again and again, almost like flu season, but plague season, which was way worse. So what's going to happen is there's going to be a lot of fighting that happens amongst the survivors, just like in that Mad Max movie allegory I mentioned. And people are fighting over land, and they're fighting over territory, and they're fighting over access to healthcare and water and that sort of stuff. There's a lot more to it. In some cases, people saw the Black Death as an excuse to forego all civil authority and law and simply use the panic of the plague to attack each other for whatever they wanted, like land and all that. So the 100 Years' War is going to happen during the era of plague. And it's not entirely about the plague. It's just that the 100 Years' War is going to be both sides, the French and the English, taking advantage of this period of time to fight each other over old issues. Okay? So what is the Hundred Years' War? It happens between 1337 and 1453. It's 116 years where there's some fighting and then years of break time and then lots of more fighting and then years of break time. Began as a dispute over who was the rightful king of France. Remember that England and France, since the Normans invaded England from France, that England and France had this kind of long history of deciding who was going to rule it. Was it a English king in charge of half of France, or a French king in charge of just the French territory, or what? You know what I mean? So it's a complicated relationship the English have with France when it comes to their heritage and who gets to rule parts of France. And so there's going to be this revival of that, who's in charge of France since the old King Richard and King John era. And that revival is going to be precipitated by a wave of the plague that comes through and basically starts this kind of idea that some fighting can happen. Anyway, the entire war is fought in France. And the interesting thing is that France was one of the most powerful countries in all of Europe when the Hundred Years' War broke out. And its nobility, its nobles were very powerful, and the nobles of France were very rich. And what that meant was that the nobles of France, each in their own right, fielded their own militaries that were run by the king during times of international warfare. And those nobles had some of the very best training and best armor and all that stuff that they needed to fight with in all of Europe. When we talk about the Middle Ages and feudalism and chivalry and courtly love and all these ideas, a lot of that came out of the French courts and French poets and French ideas of nobility and knighthood and chivalry. Even the King Arthur legend was more of a French invention than anything else, which I think is rather interesting. But again, remember, the French and the English have a complicated history, at least since the Normans. So the feudal knights are still running the show in France when England is going to invade France during the Hundred Years' War. The question is how are the English going to fight? Is it a bunch of English knights using the plagues and all that as an excuse to attack France when France is hit harder by the plague than England was, and they were suffering from it, and so here come the English? What kind of battle forces do the English use? How does that work? Who's going to win this war? A lot of fun stuff that happens with this. So the Knights of France were considered the best in Europe, and the King of France could call upon thousands of them to fight at any one time. This is that era of full armor that we're talking about, the 13 and 1400s. Full armor, sometimes for your horses as well as for your men. Armor like what you're seeing in this picture, this kind of armor would cost somebody somewhere between $40,000 to $60,000. So if you're a noble, you might be able to pull that money together, and you're going to use that, and you're going to have your armor. And you were considered a proper knight in Europe, especially in France, if you can afford that. Okay, this was just part of the show if you were in Europe. And of course, you're a noble that leads soldiers from your fiefdom, from your territory, into battle under the king's orders. And so it's you and your armor and all your supporters that go to battle. So it's like these households that go to war in France. And it's not just France, but that's kind of how that works. France has a pretty big population at the time that the 100 Years' War breaks out. 16 million people, and that's during the plague, which means that even after the plague, they still have most of these people, all right? 16 million people live in France. England doesn't have nearly that many people, all right? So not back then. So the French armies are large, way better armed and armored and even trained than the English armies. England is going to be sending troops over from England into France to use the chaos of the plague era to try to get some territory back that they lost a couple hundred years before under King John. And the English can only field a few thousand people at a time, really. So how are a few thousand people going to go up against the mass nobility of France? How are they going to do it? What are England's strengths in this war? Well, the English have developed a longbow type of technology, which is a weapon that can fire a 3-foot-long arrow, a yard arrow, okay, into French armor. So if you're an armored knight, you might be a battle tank in France, but you're also going to be facing the English, who have these longbows that from a decent distance can shoot fairly heavy arrows up into the air that will fall and can very often pierce your armor. And that is not good for you because that's not something you expect. If you're a knight in France, you expect that your horses and their men on top of the horses are going to be crashing into glorious battle against the enemy. And instead, the English have all these longbowmen because they've been training for a long time to actually develop a peasant army. Yes, I said that a peasant army is going to be going up against the nobility of the French, something that the French had never really considered being possible. The English are very experienced because of their fighting against the Scots up in the north. And the English strategies of war only fight battles that you know you can win. That's something that they learned with the Scottish. Destabilize the country through raids and scorched earth policies before battles, and capture as many nobles and knights as you can. Don't kill them. Capture them if possible, and then ransom them back to their rich families. So basically, if you are a peasant longbowman who joins the war on the side of the English and you capture a noble in battle, guess what you get to do? You can hold on to that person and then sell that person back to that French family where that knight comes from and make a fortune that you never could have made in any other career path in England. So that was a lucrative thing to go to war. If you survive, you might capture some knight who is going to have to pay you to get returned home. Okay. What are the things about the longbow that I had brought up earlier? Could pierce an inch of wood or the armor of a knight at 200 yards away. Pretty decent distance. More penetrating power, greater distance, and fired more rapidly than a crossbow. Which you could fire these things very quickly. You know, these guys train for it from childhood. If you take the history of England class, if you're interested in this stuff, we'll spend a little more time on what makes a proper longbowman, which has to do with a lot of practice over the course of one's lifetime before they're ready to go to war. Basically, the musculature to be able to pull back a 100-pound bow is remarkable, all right? Especially if you're doing it over the course of an hour, you have to be very strong, extremely strong. Okay, comparing the armies. The French maintained a feudal tradition requiring vassals, meaning people that are under the king's power, to devote 40 days a year to military service, and thousands of well-armed knights in France were the cornerstone of the entire French army and ready to go. The English, they have a contract army, a modern-style army, really, in which soldiers were paid for their service, i.e. professional soldiers, and peasant longbowmen were part of the cornerstone of the English army. Knights are the cornerstone of the French army, longbowmen from the woods, from the rural parts of England, are the cornerstone of the English army. What's the way the English pay these guys? Well, you're not a noble, so you're not just doing it because you are a vassal. If you are a peasant soldier in an English army, you're paid by winning, and you get to split up the loot. So what is that, a commission system maybe? So the first battle that we take real note of in 1346 is called the Battle of Crécy. And at that battle, 9,000 Englishmen are going to fight against 30,000 French knights. Okay, 9,000. 5,000 of those are non-armored, non-horsed soldiers. They are foot soldiers who are not supposed to even be in the front lines of the battle. 5,500 longbowmen versus 30,000 French professional knights. Okay? The king of England, Edward III, will pick the terrain and waits for the king of France, Philip VI, to show up with all of his knights. And when he does, the battle will start, and wave after wave of French cavalry charges in and are simply picked off by the longbowmen. They're just wiped out by the artillery is what's really happening. Okay? That is a rapid change in European warfare that nobody saw coming. The idea of having an army of really 5,000 longbowmen who are peasants going up against 30,000 professional French knights, nobles of Europe, just makes no sense. I mean, nobody's done this before. And here you go with the idea of trained, paid artillery troops going up against mounted nobles. A little bit about what happens as a result of this battle, the Battle of Crécy in 1346. The English are going to lose 300 guys. The French lose 10,000 guys, a lot of them nobles who are then going to be sold back to their families. Nobles in this battle had been annihilated by peasant archers, and that's going to be the beginning of the end of the nobility in warfare, the way that we're used to talking about them. The reality is that over time now, we're going to start to see a shift in Europe, thanks to the 100 Years' War, where Europeans start to figure out how to use artillery, like, say, guns. It starts with crossbows and longbows, but will evolve into guns, as opposed to using mounted cavalry. The quote here, "There died that day the finest flower of the French chivalry." That's where the battle was right there. Okay, moving on. The next big battle, about 10 years later, Battle of Poitiers, 1346. The English do the same thing, you guys. Edward III's son, Edward, also known as the Black Prince, is going to go to battle with another group of French nobles in 1356. And again, the longbowmen are going to mow down the French who come charging in and get stuck in the mud, really, during a major rainstorm. Battle of Poitiers is right here. Look at these two battles. This is the English territory that is regained. For the first time in a couple hundred years, the English are taking back this territory that they've had since the time of Richard the Lionheart and before. Okay, so the English are using the 100 Years' War and the Great Plagues that keep on coming through as their way to regain old territory, the territory of Aquitaine that they used to have back because of the whole Normandy connection. Okay, so a treaty is signed, and Edward III is now the ruler of about 1/3 of France. You know, the English king is the ruler of 1/3 of France. How's this going to go now? Henry V comes along. Okay. By the way, at this point, by the time we get to the 1400s, it is now a tradition. If you become the King of England, you have to invade France for a while. It just becomes part of how you prove that you're a good English king. It's part of your nationalistic spirit if you would take an army into France and beat up some knights. So the King of England, 1412 to 1422, Henry V. Shakespeare writes a lot about this guy. Okay, that famous speech, St. Crispian's Day, which I'm not going to play for this, but I will for the England class if you decide to take that. Henry V gains military experience crushing rebellions in Wales and in northern England, mostly against the Scots. And he's going to go ahead and say, I wish to take more territory in France and rule it as an English king. And he is a great warrior king, okay? And what is he going to do, Henry V? Battle of Agincourt. And at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, Henry is going to do the same damn thing that the other two kings did, which nobody... The French knew that this could happen. It's just that the thing is that Henry V had been in France for a while, and he was on his way out. He was actually being surrounded by such a big French army in 1415 in October that Henry V was trying to get out of France. He was fleeing. He was running away with a very small army to get out of France because he had kind of run his course and needed to get out. And he's about to get to Calais, which is a English owned seaport in France, and he's about to get to his escape when the French cut him off. And there's going to be this big battle that the English were not ready for. So again, however, the longbowmen are going to win the battle. All right, and this is the last major land battle between the English and the French in history, okay, where they fight each other when it comes to the knights going up against the peasant longbowmen. And once again, even though Henry V's army was actually very small, something like I think it was like 7,000 troops going up against 45,000 French. You know, the end result is just ridiculous how well the English did. They survived when they all thought they were going to die. One last battle, which is just a siege. Something happens at the end of the 100 Years' War that's going to allow the French to retake a bunch of his territory and push the English out of France for good. The French town of Orleans had been under siege by the English for 6 months, and it was felt that England could gain ultimate victory in the war. Plague-ravaged France would surrender, and England could take half of France again and hold on to it for a long time. That was the idea. And then this girl shows up, you guys, named Joan of Arc, who, if you were back then, would say was touched by God. Today, you'd probably call her a schizophrenic. I don't know. But either way, she said that God talked to her, and she is going to revive French spirit to fight against the English. And the end result is that 9 days after Joan of Arc led an army to Orleans to lift the siege, the English have to retreat and run away and are defeated. They have to get out of France. So there's a much bigger story to this. I just don't want to make this lecture longer than it needs to be. Interestingly, in 1430, Joan of Arc is going to be captured by Burgundians. Burgundians are French-speaking dudes up in the north of France, and they were on the side of the English this whole time. They were not really united as French people. They were kind of their own little French-speaking state like the Normans were back in the 1066 days. So here we are in 1430, and the Burgundians are going to kidnap Joan when she wasn't looking, and they hand her over to the English. The English will then set her on fire for heresy, being a woman claiming that she speaks to God, and she is killed. But now the French martyr her. The French see her as being the ultimate martyr for French glory, and the French rise up and keep on fighting against the English, and the English are finally, longbows and all, kicked out of France. Now here's the deal. During this last battle, the end, I have not mentioned this yet, the French are bringing in gunpowder weapons. Cannons actually show up in the French army and start to get fired at the English troops. And the English cannot hold on because the cannons are knocking down, or cannonballs really, are knocking down the walls of the English fortresses. This is new technology. Whenever you wanted to knock down a fortress, you had to bring things like trebuchets, which were huge devices that took a lot of work to move. A cannon, it might be heavy, but it was a lot easier to move than a trebuchet. And the French are going to have several of these cannons that they're going to use along with Joan of Arc there, kind of raising up national spirit. You've got the French with these newfangled cannons that are knocking down English-held castles. So we are now shifting into the modern age. One thing the English have taught us, paid peasant troops with superior weapons can win against nobles. And one thing the French teach us is that adapting modern gunpowder weapons is the way to go if you're going to keep on being a superpower in Europe as we move forward. So, what this means is that now that we have cannons, the English cannot hold on to their fortresses and they have to leave France. So Joan of Arc becomes a national symbol. The French continue to force out the English. And that is what happens. All right? The only place that has English rule left in all of France is going to be right here. Final thoughts. Legacy of the 100 Years' War. The feudal system itself was undermined as knights were no longer the cornerstone of an army. And you needed the feudal system and knights to do that. If you don't need knights to be the cornerstone of your army, why have a feudal system? And so that's going to start to change as some countries slowly but surely evolve out of old school feudalism and begin to create different kinds of more complex governments. Professional armies consisting of archers, pikemen, and gunpowder are going to be what now wins battles. So the age of knights on horseback are coming to a close. And knights were no longer as important to a king because of all this. Because, if a king could run an army that happens to have archers, pikemen, and gunpowder, why do you need, nobles? You know what I mean? So nobles help control the land for you, but they're not going to be as powerful if you don't need their armies anymore. You can just hire the peasants to fight for you, right? So anyway, that's it. That's 3 major topics. That's some aspects of Islam, some aspects of the Great Schism of the Catholic Church, and the 100 Years' War, which helps to move Europe into a more modern age of warfare and statehood. Okay, thanks a lot.